There's been a big stalemate over housing. This is the government's housing bill for affordable housing and social housing. Of course, it was up to the Greens and Labor to do a deal on this. The coalition wasn't interested. Eventually, it was done after quite a bit of to and fro. Joining me now is the Greens leader, Adam Bandt. Thanks for your time. You extracted a bit, but nothing really concrete extra for renters. Did you consider holding out? Was it a close run thing as to whether you'd do this deal?
Well, going in, we said there were two things that were of concern to us. One was that there was no money being spent on housing now, when we're in the middle of a housing and rental crisis. The government's vehicle involved money coming later and none of it was guaranteed. And we managed to secure an extra $3 billion. The government had said that there was no capacity to just fund housing directly out of the budget. And we pushed and pushed and pushed. And first there was $2 billion and then an additional $1 billion. As you mentioned, though, the second issue that was of concern for us is the rental crisis that we're in. And it is a crisis for a lot of people. We couldn't get Labor to care about renters, the third of the country that rents. And we pushed hard for rent caps and rent freeze. And Labor, they gathered together a national cabinet where Labor has every seat at the table on the mainland. And they said they backed unlimited rent increases. Now, that's disappointing that the government's taken that position. And so we're going to now have to continue that fight and shift it to the remainder of Parliament.
We'll talk about that in a moment, but just on the money. So extra money is there. What are the requirements? Does it have to be spent? Is it just there and available for various state schemes? Is it necessarily going to be spent in that time frame, or is it just available?
Well, it's money that will be put not into the HAF when that's established. It's money that's going to be made, put into the National or Housing Australia, the National Housing and Finance Investment Corporation, the government's investment vehicle, that's going to be there for the states, for the community housing providers to build public and community housing. And the message that we've heard loud and clear from from public and community housing advocates is that there's capacity to build a lot more than what the government has been saying, much more than the $500 million a year. And so now, on top of the $2 billion that's already sitting in bank accounts, this is $1 billion that is now available to go out the door.
So it's available. It doesn't have to be spent in that year. If the industry is struggling to build it in time, whatever it might be, it's sitting there. It might not all be spent, but
that's
it's all
not
available.
the message that we're
I understand what you're saying, but if there were a delay for whatever reason, approvals, anything like that.
Well, on approvals, the message that we're hearing from the construction... Well, I'd say two things. Firstly, the message that we're hearing from the construction industry very clearly is that because people are under such significant mortgage pressure at the moment and house prices are so high that are really pushing people to the wall, come the end of this year, there's going to be a need for new projects to come online. And so this can be that. Second is state governments have got a lot of their own projects and they own a lot of land where they can effectively control the public housing that they build there. They've now got no excuse for not putting the foot on the accelerator and building that public.
You mentioned continuing the pressure on rent and perhaps a rent freeze is your desired outcome, even though I don't think any states are keen on that. How will you do that? Is it that you won't support the legislation for the Help to Buy scheme unless something happens in the rental area? Is that where we're shifting to now?
States might not be keen of it, but renters are keen on caps and freeze on rent increases. And renters need breathing space to deal with the housing crisis. So we're going to keep pushing. And so I know the state leaders say that they're not keen on that. Not that long ago, Labor was saying to us there's no additional money in the kitty available to spend on housing, and we proved that that was wrong. And I know that Labor premiers and the Prime Minister are saying that they back unlimited rent increases. That is something we're going to push on because I don't think that's...
Well, there's a big difference between unlimited and rent freezes, though, because quite a few are moving towards limiting of rent increases, but you can still increase versus freeze.
Well, this is the problem. We've got the ACT where there is a cap on how much rents can rise by. And one of the things we saw Labor in Victoria dip their toe in the water and look at putting cap on rent increases. And then critically, one of the things they said is, well, they're concerned about doing it. If they do it and other states don't, what impact will it have? And that's why we think these kind of reforms need to be driven nationally.
But is the more realistic one on that to have caps rather than freezes?
Well, we've said we're willing to negotiate and we've pushed for caps and freeze on rent. So freeze rents for a while and then cap how much they can go up after. If the government came back to us and said, look, let's have a discussion about a cap like they have in the ACT. We'd love to have that discussion, but instead, what we're getting from Labor backs unlimited rent.
The interesting thing on the freezers aspect is things have gotten worse for a lot of renters over the past couple of years. They've got much worse for property investors. Interest rate increases for them. Some of them are, on not that expensive a house, might be $10,000 worse off a year, and they might be recouing, a couple of grand in increases in rent. So do you have sympathy for them? They'd be put in an even worse position if there was a freeze in that situation.
Well, property investors have the capacity to pass some of that increase on. They can pass it on either to the renters or they can claim some of it through negative giving.
But even from that in a net sense.
Renters can't, right? And so it's the consequence of what you've just said is that all the pain gets pushed onto renters.
But hang on.
Is untenable.
That's not true that all the pain gets passed on, because we're talking about increases on interest rates. When we're talking about 4% of maybe $10,000, $12,000 in interest payments, that can't all be passed on to a renter. There's no one that's copping a rental increase that's that big in the property they live in.
At the moment, the pain is being borne predominantly by the third of the country who rents, and there is nothing.
Well, what do you base that on when you say more pain?
But let's look, because they're the ones who are copying rent increases that many of them can't afford. And there's a third of the country who rents. Labor's got no plan for them. The Liberals have got no plan for them. What is clear is that only the Greens are fighting for renters, and because they can't pass the pain on. Like, what do? When you get a rent increase that you can't afford, you either find a way of paying it or you find yourself homeless.
A property investor can't just pass it all on. They can't just say, I'm going to jack up rent $10,000. That's property.
Well, let's look at these. We're not talking here about the Greens' position is to say, well, let's look at these property investors that have got multiple properties. At the moment, still under Labor, the single biggest line item that they're spending on is tax breaks.
Most property investors have,
property
by the vast number, have one property.
Well, we're talking about the ones who own two or more.
But you're not talking about rental caps or freezers for only people that own. For people with multiple only, are you?
We're saying very, very clearly at the moment the system is broken.
But hang on,
the system is broken.
On your caps and freezers.
No, we're talking about it across the board.
Yes.
We're talking about it across the board.
So when you say our issue is with investment property owners, that's fine, but your policy doesn't cover them. It covers the vast majority of people who have one investment property and will be struggling to pass that on.
Well, again, I make the point that if people have chosen that as their investment strategy, they go into it knowing that that the government's going to bear some of that, because you get to write some of it off as a tax loss. And also, what we know, and the data is showing this, what they're doing is putting up rents. Right, that is how.
But not nowhere near as much as the interest rates have increased.
Well, you may say that, but the renters at the moment are in crisis. Two-thirds of the country. But no one's
rent's going up $12,000.
Two-thirds of the people who rent. Two-thirds of the people who rent are in financial stress at the moment. Right, are in financial stress. What you're outlining is a housing system that at the moment that treats housing as an opportunity to make a profit rather than a human right, and that's where we need a mind shift.
One of the interesting things about rents around the world, investment rules and so on, is that rental properties are actually a more efficient use of housing. Rental properties tend to have more people in them than if someone buys them. Are you wary of that if you do change the rules quite quickly and investors sell out, and you'll say, well, fair enough, you can sell your property, you'll make a win, good luck to you, that actually the housing crisis could get worse because the efficiency of renting isn't there. People will be selling. Maybe first home buyers are getting in, but overnight we have, even bigger shortage of housing.
Well, this is part of the reason that we've been pushing so hard for the government to get back into the business of directly spending and investing in public housing. Because
but you can't do that overnight.
It takes
years to change that stuff.
And that's why we need a rent freeze until those new.
But if you start the rent freeze now, then people might sell overnight, and you've got the shortage before you've got the solution.
Well, we're saying we're coming at it two-pronged approach. Let's get government back in the business, taxing the big corporations and using that money to build public and community housing while that stock is coming online. Renters need breathing space.
Okay.
We need a
you might create
freeze
that
on
gap.
rent.
But
in the meantime, the consequence of what you're saying is that renters have just got to keep bearing the pain.
Well, they could have a cap. Well, they could have a cap. Okay, quickly on this. So are you going to say we won't support Help to Buy unless some change happens on the renting landscape? Well, is it that simple?
There's more legislation coming down the line where the Greens may be in balance of power, and we're going to keep fighting.
That seems like a pretty clear one and a related one.
Rent increases.
Is that something you're considering, saying we don't pass it unless something does happen on renting?
Well, we'll see the legislation when it comes in. all of the options are on the table for us at the moment because we are going to escalate our fight for rent freeze and caps because something needs to be done to address the rental crisis.
Okay, same for PRRT. Could that be another one?
Well, on PRRT, you've got a tax that was written by the gas industry that the gas industry is begging the Parliament to pass.
So you just basically won't, sorry to jump in very early on that one, we're nearly out of time, but is that just a position you're not going to pass it at the moment regardless? It needs to be more money raised?
We need to make these big gas corporations pay their fair share of tax and use that to fund the services that people expect.
Meaning you wouldn't pass it as is?
Let's see if and when the government decides to bring the legislation forward, but something that's written by the gas industry. Why do they want it passed? Because they'll keep getting away with making profits without paying tax.
Adam Bandt, thanks for your time.
Thanks.